Hi everyone, my name is Mattias Bjärnemalm. I'm normally called Mob because it's much shorter. And I'm having this not for your benefit, but for my own. Um, anyways, so I work as a policy advisor in the European Parliament. And I've been spending the last couple of years on the Copyright Directive. So I've basically been working with this since it was first announced. I did a lot of speeches about it during the process, and then after the process I haven't done any until this. So I've basically forgotten anything I've ever said about it. So I have, for the first time ever, a cheat sheet with dates and numbers, because I can't remember dates and numbers. So, and sometimes it's useful. So I have it all here. Hopefully I won't need too much. But if you have any questions, you might see me take up that one. And if you have any really tricky questions, I might even Google it on my phone. So those are the two distractions that might happen. Basically, when I talk, I don't do slides, because then I just stand like this looking at my own slides, and that's not your benefit. So we're skipping the slides. And I like to be interrupted, because that gives me a little bit of time to think about what I should have said instead of what I actually did say. So whenever you have a question, feel free to interrupt me with that. If you want to just come and join, you can just interrupt me and go sit wherever. If you want to switch places, that's also perfectly fine. If you want, but when you do have a question, I've been told that I need to repeat the question. So if you have a question, you say the question, and I don't repeat it, please indicate that I forgot to repeat the question by saying you forgot to repeat the question, or some other code words for that. Okay, I think we have all the rules. Is there anyone who feel, uncertain about the rules? Okay, my time here is up. Thank you very much. Uh, no, so apparently I have until 6:30 where your attention will be redirected at the pizzas. But you might have had some really interesting questions that I actually have to think about, or Google a little bit longer about. And if that is the case, I will come back to those after the pizza. So there will be a chance for follow-up discussions after the pizzas. If you feel you've had enough of me, you can just have the pizza and leave. Or, if all of you had enough of me, I will leave. That's one or the other. But anything I haven't had the time to say, I will just fill that in after the pizza, because apparently the pizza break, there's no room for maneuver on the pizza break. It's a strict rule. So I do have it's cleverly hidden there. Yes. Yes. No, no, no. I'm all set, and I can also reach that. And there's tons of people that have waters, so if they're not careful, I might just go and take theirs. Uh, so normally when I talk, I start talking about myself. Because it's one of my favorite topic. If there's a smaller group, I will just ask everyone's names, because I like to know who I'm talking to. You're just too many. So if you have a question, I will not, say yes, Johan. I will just point at people randomly. Hopefully, it will be the person who have the question. But I will try to involve you as much as possible in the conversation, and I might do that by asking you questions, and then I will repeat them, because that's the rules. So, my name is Mattias Bjärnemalm. I'm called Mob because it's much shorter, and I've been working in the European Parliament since 2011. I moved down to work as head of office for one of the Swedish members of parliament, Amelia Andersdotter, who I think spoken 2 or 3 times at Foo Café, but I'm not sure if she's ever spoken at Critical Tech. And I stayed with her until 2014, and then after the elections, when the Swedish Pirate Party wasn't re-elected, I worked with the German pirate Julia Reda, who got elected. And as part of the negotiations she had with the political groups, I ended up working as a policy advisor. So my job is not based on competence; I'm a political bribe. Fortunately, with time you get some competence, and so I've sort of, by now I know what I'm doing. And what I do, what a policy advisor do, is that we advise the politicians in the European Parliament. So every political group, okay, there's a lot of things about European Parliament you might not know. So if I skip steps, just tell me to backtrack to, so you can actually understand how it works. We elect parliamentarians. They hire staff that work for them. They also join political groups with like-minded parliamentarians. Those groups hire staff that work for the group. I'm one of those. So I'm hired by one of the political groups to assist the members of that group. I don't work with one individual parliamentarian. I work with all parliamentarians in the Green IFA group where I work, and I cover the topic digital policy. So most advisors work tied to one specific committee, and they do all kinds of legislative work in that committee. I'm horizontal, so I work with digital policies wherever they go, and mostly I coordinate my different colleagues who have digital policies in their committees. And the idea is that all our members should A, know what they're talking about, and B, hopefully say roughly the same thing in different committees. And these are all elected politicians, so that's a bit of a challenge. But that's how I get my kicks. So, the copyright directive. The full name would be copyright in the digital single market something 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 amending directive something and amending directive something. They always have long name. But the copyright directive or the copyright in the digital single market directive, those tend to be the two things we call it in the bubble. And does anyone know when it was proposed? It's because you don't have my. I mean, you can borrow this. I thought I wouldn't need to use it if you had a date, but it's September 2016. So basically, when we elect European Parliament, after that, the Council appoints the head of the Commission. The head of the Commission puts forth an agenda for the next 5 coming years. So after the elections 2014. We got Jean-Claude Juncker as the head of the European Commission. And he had sort of a manifesto of 5 things that he would do during his mandate. And one of them was, surprisingly enough, copyright reform. He would break down national silos and harmonize European copyright and bring it into the digital age. That sounded pretty good. I mean, being a copyright critic, I want that. And then, the next thing after these bold political speeches is that reality comes in. And reality is that we have 28 member states. Depends on when you're watching this recording. My partner is British, and she's working for one of the British MEPs. It's actually not fun at all. And that is what makes it fun. The member states don't want to harmonize copyright. And the reason is copyright is important for the cultural sector, and the cultural sector has a strong lobby power in all of the member states. So basically, in any country, there is a strong lobby to push the kind of copyright they have developed in their respective country. And it's seen as a cultural policy, and cultural policies are not normally EU competence. So the head of the Commission promised to harmonize European copyright. And the first thing that basically happened was that the member states told him discreetly that will never happen. So then they had to sort of lower their expectations a bit. And you could tell that had happened when the proposal came. Because there's 2 types of EU legislation. Does anyone know the difference or the names? Well, I do, because I work with this. There's directives and there's regulations. Directives are adopted by the EU, and then the member states implement them in their national legislation. So basically, the directive will say, you should have a law saying X, and then the member state adopts a law any way they want that includes X. And a regulation basically is a law directly. So the moment you pass a regulation, that becomes an applicable law in all member states instantly. Or in the regulation, it normally says when it has entered into force. So if you want to harmonize copyright, it's very clear. You need a regulation. That's because then you get one set of laws that applies everywhere. Super simple. I mean, they might be complex, but the process is simple. You have the regulation, it's done. And, roughly a year after Juncker, 2 years almost after Juncker told us about his grand vision of a harmonized European copyright, we got a proposal for a directive. But we actually didn't only get a proposal for a directive because it was a package. They tend to put forth legislation in packages. So it was actually a directive and a regulation. And the regulation is called, we call it SATCAB, Satellite and Cable Regulation. It basically regulates satellite and cable broadcasts. So it's a very minor detail, but that is, they figured this we can actually do with a regulation. So they put that in a regulation, and then they put everything else in a directive. And that was, at that point, so when the proposal was presented in 2016, we knew there would not be an harmonization of European copyright. The whole, vision that had been presented was dead in the waters by then. Ever since, we've just dealt with, this proposal for a directive and see what we could do with that. But of course, there's time in between. So when the Commission tells us in the European Parliament and in the Council that they will propose legislation, the Parliament like to be seen as proactive. So they like it to be seen as if they are the one leading the Commission. That's not the case, but we like to have that image. So what we did, the moment we knew that there will be a new proposal for a copyright legislation, is that the Parliament decided in their own wisdom to evaluate the previous directive, so that in that evaluation the Parliament could give some suggestions for the Commission on what they should do with the new directive or regulation or whatever. And if the Parliament actually managed to get something right and the Commission would propose that, the Parliament could say, look, they're doing what we're telling them. It's just, whenever that happens, it's a fluke. The Commission is not sitting around waiting for input from the Parliament on these things. They have expert groups, they have stakeholder meetings and all kinds of stuff, and they're not relying on the Parliament for that kind of input. But the Parliament likes to think so. So we had and the old copyright directive. Does anyone know the name of that one? Okay, the old copyright directive from 2001 is called Harmonization of Certain Aspects of Copyright in the Information Society Directive. Amending Directive this and that. We call it InfoSoc. We call it the InfoSoc Directive. So the old is the InfoSoc Directive, the new is the Digital Single Market Copyright Directive. Those are the two names to know. But if you really want to impress someone with your EU knowledge, try to say harmonization of certain aspects of copyright in the information society. Right? Look, I can't even say it. It's a bit long. So we evaluated that, and basically what the Parliament then found. Oh, actually, I will stop there. So the Parliament evaluated the previous directive to see if we could influence the Commission that way. The member states in the Council, they have a more direct approach. So when it's not Juncker who writes all the legislation himself. That's not how it works. He sets out the grand vision, and then you have the full Commission. And within the Commission, you have different commissioners for different topics, and they are. Well, basically, what happens is that all the member states throw a name in the hat, and then Juncker takes the hat and he matches those names with different portfolios. Except that some member states might put a little note on their name, like it would be really nice if we got this portfolio. So Germany, who has a fairly strong publishing lobby. They have all the large publishing houses in Europe basically are German. There's some Dutch, but the German publishing houses are extremely strong. They have a really good connection with the Conservative Party in Germany. So they nudged their government and said, this copyright thing, we could have this neighboring rights that we've been introducing in Germany that failed and that we've been, promoting on the European level for 150 years. Only thing that needs for that to happen is say that the German commissioner would be one in charge of this reform. So Germany worked its magic, and everyone agreed, or Juncker proposed that Günther Oettinger, who is the German commissioner, should be the commissioner for digital society and economy, which is the one in charge of DJ Connect, which is the DJ within the Commission that writes all the laws on digital policies. So, no, it's Directoral Generate. Yes, department. It's probably as a French word originally. Anyways, that's the part of the Commission that deals with this. And then, because digitalization is important, they also had a vice president of the Commission who was in charge of digital policies in general, and that was Andrus Ansip. So he was technically above Juncker in the hierarchy. The difference is that Juncker is in charge of the whole DJ, the whole department, and Ansip has a cabinet of a handful of members. So they were the two commissioners that could influence this. One was in charge of all the staff, and one had 10 people working for him, but was technically the higher ranking one. Also, one of them came from Germany, and Germany has some influence in EU matters. So that is what the member states do when they want to affect policy. They basically go directly to the commissioners and try to influence them. And since they have a commissioner from every member state, they have a fairly good chance of getting influence into the commission. So we got Juncker as the commissioner in charge, and some floor. Sorry, who did I say? Juncker. Yeah, no, Oettinger. Sorry, that's good. At least you're on your toes, even if I'm not. So Oettinger got in charge, and DG Connect started doing their magic. And in September 2016, they had a proposal. Before that, we had adopted a review in the Parliament of the InfoSoc Directive. We suggested harmonization of all exceptions and limitations. Basically, the biggest problem with copyright is that while copyright works more or less the same in all member states, the exceptions and limitations that allow us to use copyrighted material in some instances is different. So educational purposes. In some countries, we have licensing schemes. Like in Sweden, schools have a license to be allowed to use copyrighted material in education. In some countries, they have an exception. Schools are allowed to use copyrighted material in education. And of course, those exceptions are not exactly the same. Freedom of panorama, basically the right to take photos of copyrighted material in the public sphere, buildings, arts, and so on. Different in different countries. In some countries, you're not, well, most countries have it now, but they didn't have it back then. They've sort of introduced it. The last couple of countries, I think, recently passed it. In Austria, I think you have to stand on public ground to be allowed to take a picture of art in the public. So if you're on your balcony, that would be a copyright infringement, but if you're on the ground, it wouldn't. And of course, if you're on an Austrian balcony taking a photo of something in Germany, Austrian laws apply. In France, back then, they didn't have freedom of panorama, so you could take a picture of the Eiffel Tower because copyright had expired. You couldn't take a picture of Eiffel Tower by night because the light show was still protected by copyright. Now they have freedom of panorama in that sense, so you can take as many pictures of the Eiffel Tower as you want to. I've taken a handful. But I was still hoping that it would be legal at the time, but it wasn't. So, I was too late. But when I started in the European Parliament, I actually took a picture of the building of the European Parliament in Strasbourg every time I went and put online, because civil disobedience, that was a crime every single time. Because in France at that time, you couldn't take pictures of architectural buildings that had copyright. And the European Parliament in Strasbourg, is all its splendor is definitely copyright protected. Anyways, so freedom of panorama everywhere. People shouldn't be surprised to find that when they go on vacation and take a picture and put as their holiday pictures online, suddenly they commit a crime that wouldn't have been a crime back home. Simple thing to fix. And then the majority in the parliament said that's a little bit too far, so we will not have that because, it shouldn't be easy. So the text from the parliament, even though it was written by Julia Reda, who's from the German Pirate Party and very much pro exceptions and limitations, was still a fairly compromisal text. It didn't push, it wasn't very edgy, it had mild suggestions to make things better, and they were all ignored by the Commission when they presented their text. Not because it was Julia Reda who wrote it, but because that is how the Commission treats this kind of text from the Parliament. So what we got was, the Copyright Directive, which had, 18 articles or something? And it's basically, you try to fix a little thing here and a little bit there and something there. So it's sort of a catch-all of different small fixes. It had an exception for text and data mining. That was okay, but we made it better. It had exceptions for cross-border educational purposes. Because, if you have different rules for education in different countries, what happens when you have an online learning platform in a university in one country that shares copyrighted material in that platform, but the user is sitting in another country receiving that? You would have two sets of copyright legislation to deal with, but with this directive, there was a suggestion for a standardized set of rules for these situations so that you should be able to actually, cross borders with your university courses and so on. That also made sense. There's things in this that are perfectly fine. There's a part about artists being entitled to know how the entities that they sell their copyright to monetize it. So in the past, because normally that would be a contractual agreement, if you sell, like all musicians basically sell the copyright to the record label, and then the record label gives them some money based on that contract. But unless it states in that contract that they have any right to know how much money the record label makes with that music, they don't. But with this text, there's actually a provision saying that, if you sell your copyright to someone, you still have the right to know how they monetize it. And if they don't monetize it, you can ask to have the copyright back, or do you have some mechanism to get it back? And if they make a fortune out of it and they screwed you in the contract, you can go to an independent third body and ask to have a contract adjustment. Makes perfect sense. Has very little to do with digital issues, but the problem arose when artists realized that they had signed contracts that was very clear in how much money they would get from record sales and had nothing about getting money for digital sales. So artists were basically pissed because they didn't get anything for money being made by record labels on digital sales. So that is how that ended up in this directive. It's a good fix. There's good things in it. And then you had Article 11 and 13. Is there anyone who don't know what Article 11 and 13 are? Wow. When you live in this world, you think that this is everything everyone is talking about all the time. And then you go on Twitter and you see all your followers tweeting about the same thing as you. And you're like, this is, nothing else is going on in the world but the copyright reform right now. So Article 11, we used to call it the link tax. It's a new neighboring right for press publishers. So basically, very simple. When you publish something, if you're a publisher, because it only applies to press publishers, and you publish something online or in a newspaper, the publisher get a separate right to that publication. So the writer has if it is copyright protected material, so if it is unique enough to be copyright protected, then the author has that copyright, but there's a separate right for the press publisher. And that applies to all of it. So it applies to the picture and the text and the layout. And if you have numbers, it applies to that. If you have a recipe which isn't covered by a copyright for whatever reason, this neighboring right would still apply to that recipe. So it's weaker than copyright because it's much more limited in term, but it's broader than copyright because it covers everything. And the idea with this was to make sure that when Google News had snippets with a little picture and the description of a news article, so that some people only read that instead of clicking all the way to the newspaper, well, basically that is what the newspaper claims. They just read on Google News and they don't read articles anymore. And therefore, if Google News put it there, the publisher should be able to ask for compensation from Google. And it's broader than that, so it will also be if you put articles on Facebook or wherever, as soon as it goes to the public, and it's not by individual non-profit use, the publisher can ask for compensation. That's the idea. And then in the beginning, we weren't sure whether that would go down to the level of just having the link and they would still be able to ask for compensation. That is why the name link tax came, because basically we were worried that you could interpret the Commission proposal that if someone published a link to an article from a news publication, not any link, that news publication would be entitled to ask for revenue. Now we managed to restrict it, so it's only commercial use, and it's only and very short excerpts are excluded. So you can still have the old-fashioned blue link, and you can have like a one-line description. How long that line will be, this is a directive, that depends on national implementation. So it might depend on which country you're in. But likely it's likely that it will be shorter than 11 words. Because there's a ruling on copyright that says that 11 words is something that can have copyright value. What? One? So, yeah. So the text doesn't say how long it should be. It says short excerpts, and then in the explanations it says that it's basically the current practice that are used by platforms should be covered by this right. So it should clearly be shorter than what platforms normally do. If you put an article on Facebook, you get the picture and you get a little snippet from the article. It should be less than that. That would be allowed in the future, unless Facebooks want to pay. That's Article 11. It's stupid. It won't work, but it's not really fundamentally harmful for freedom of expression or how the net works. And then we had Article 13, and that is basically how we call it censorship filters. You have a question?
Should I take a question about Article 11 now before we start the podcast?
Yes, you should ask your question about Article 11 now before I continue to 13.
Okay.
Look, I'm doing that.
I guess that the user is going to be in the European Union, and the user that reads the article and the newspaper, that the publisher will be the European Union, but the big corporation that owns the platform is probably not going to be in the European Union. So how is that going to work out from?
So the question is, from a law point of view, how does it work when the platform is outside the European Union and the newspaper and the user are inside? Well, European Union law applies to companies who target the European market. So if European courts decide that a company targets the European market, normally by having a language version or subscribers in that country, there's tons of different ways to notice this. All the big platforms target the European market. Then the European Union thinks that European law applies. Now, if a company wants to challenge that, they can challenge that in court. If they don't want to pay to the European Union would technically have to contact the country of origin and have the legal service there help them with the whole thing. But no company wants to be blocked in the EU, so companies will comply. So if you don't target the European Union, but there are users in the European Union using your platform, fine. But at the end of the day, you might have to geo-block the European Union to prove to the courts that you're not targeting the European Union. So they will pay.
So the only good way to dodge it, if you're a big company, you would have to not have any business in Europe, so you can't be called into court in Europe.
So you're asking if you should avoid it by not having any business in Europe. Yes, you shouldn't have customers in Europe. If you don't have any customers in Europe, you're fine. Yes, exactly. If a private person posts on Facebook, Facebook is putting it up there. It's clearly defined that if you have your private blog, you're safe. Even if it's public on your private blog, it's written to make sure that private non-profit use, even when it's public, is safe. But if it is a platform doing it, well, then it's covered. Yes. Yes, I'm going to go to 13 right now, and that will answer your question. Article 13 is the upload filters. Basically, what Article 13 does is that it establishes that when a platform publish anything, when a platform that is covered by the definition of platform in this text, which is any platform that allows users to upload large amounts of copyrighted material, legally, like not illegal copyright material, but legally copyrighted material. They are covered by this directive and Article 13, and then it says that when they do, the platform is performing an act of communication to the public, and this means committing a crime. So communication to the public is one of the things you're allowed to do if you have the copyright. If you don't have the copyright, you're not allowed to communicate to the public something that is copyrighted. So only if you have the copyright or if you have a license to use the copyrighted material are you allowed to communicate to the public. So by saying the platforms are communicating to the public, it says when a user uploads, the platform commits a crime. That doesn't mean that the user doesn't commit a crime. They commit one crime and then the platform commits another crime. One action, two crimes. Just in a second. And then it continues to explain how the platform can mitigate the liability. And it basically says that if it has a license, it's fine, which, that makes sense because then there's no copyright infringement because it had a license. If it doesn't have a license, it needs to do best efforts to ensure the non-availability of the work. With due diligence and high industry standards, and there's lots of, things, but basically that means filtering. The Commission has been clear. If it's a very small platform with very little work, you could manually filter things. If it's a big platform, automatic filtering is the only way to fulfill that criteria. Because it's not remove. Currently, we have a system that is called notice and takedown. If you put something illegal on a platform and they get informed, they have to take it down. That's the current regime. With this, you have that they have to filter it beforehand, but they only have to filter for works that copyright holders have told them are copyrighted. So they don't have to filter automatically for everything that anyone has ever done in high school. It has to be a copyright holder or their organizations who have informed them that this is my copyright, no one else can put this online. But the moment you do that, and you can all do it because you've all written something that is copyrighted or drawn a picture or whatever, so you can all contact the platforms now and give them a copy of your work and say that they should filter it away so no one else can put it online, and then they're obliged to do that for you. You're welcome.
Isn't that impossible?
It is. But yes. No, it's totally impossible, and it's all kinds of copyright. I'll very briefly come back to why it was, what it's intended to solve. But the next step is, and the reason that it's supposed to be impossible is because you want to push the platforms to go for licenses. Because if they have licenses, then of course they don't have to filter things away, except all the things they don't have licenses for that anyone wants them to block. We are. Yes. No, we discussed this. We are dealing with huge numbers. This will be impossible. And they say, yes, but artists want this. And, reality artists, you have to choose one. I'll come to your questions very shortly. I'm running short of time before pizza, so you might have to keep on to those questions afterwards. We'll see if we get to them. Fun fact, I was supposed to do the entire timeline much more in details and talk way less about the actual articles, but this is clearly where you have questions, so let's stick with this. So, if you do filter for things that you don't have permission to upload, which is most things, and it still gets online, when you get informed, you still have the duty to take it down. But now with this new text, you also have the duty to keep it down, which is what we in the business call notice and stay down, which means, basically add it to your filter. And you have an extra requirement to make sure that things that have ever at any time being uploaded to your platform illegally should never be uploaded there again. That requirement isn't in the current regime. So basically, you put something on YouTube, the industry tells them, they take it down. Someone else put the same thing on YouTube, the industry tells them, it takes it down, and it's sort of a whack-a-mole. And that was the industry tried to avoid with this notice and stay down regime. So, why did we end up with this? Well, the industry wanted it. Basically, the music industry wanted it to fix what they call the value gap. I rarely do air quotes, but the value gap is such a great... It's the best thing any PR firm has ever come up with. The value gap is the difference between what the music industry gets from YouTube and what they want to get from YouTube. And the reason here is that the music industry sits on a monopoly for their work. So almost in any other negotiation, they can say if you don't agree to our terms, you can't use our work. And Spotify wouldn't exist without license to all the music there. YouTube don't need copyrighted material from the music industry. So basically they said, well, if you don't accept our terms, we don't put your work, we will continue to remove your work under the current regime. And so the music industry signed licenses with YouTube 8 years ago, but they want more money. And that is why they created the myth of the value gap, and that is why we have this article. It's the music industry that wants more money from YouTube. And then every other platform is an innocent bystander caught in the fray. Yes. But the artists. So no, it's the music industry that will get this money. It's not, then they might pass something on to the artist through a trickle down and all that things. But basically, the music industry wanted more money, and this is how they think they will get it. They are not entitled to more money. They're just in a better bargaining position because they can say, if you don't agree to our new terms, you will have to remove our content and you will have to make sure that it never comes up again, and that will be expensive for your filtering tools. And if you fail, we will sue you. And that's sort of, so sign our new license agreement, please. That's the idea. And of course, they can expand this to all other platforms. Now, in the work, we try to say, okay, but if it's only the licenses, and we don't mind if YouTube have to pay more. Can't we find a text that just basically says YouTube and similar platforms have to sign licenses whenever they're offered, and within reasonable terms, and then a court could say, if the money is reasonable or not. But then comes the film industry. The film industry don't want their content online because they have the business model of cinemas. So they was heavily against anything that only focused on licenses, and they wanted the notice and stay down. So the text is a compromise of pushing for licenses so that the music industry might get more money, but then also imposing this new notice and stay down mechanism so that film industry can be more certain than ever before that things that are hand filmed, well, now it's like in cameras in cinemas and then uploaded will be taken down and stay down. And that is why we got Article 13 the way it is. That's sort of the reasoning behind. And then, you have all kind of nice words and so on, but basically those are the lobby interests behind these articles. And that is why it was proposed by the Commission, more or less the same way as it ended up. And right now, we have 7 minutes for me to explain the legislative process of the European Parliament and the Council. That will work super fine. Okay, here, the Commission proposed something, it goes into the Parliament and the Council in parallel. They both work with it, and whenever they agree on a text, it's done, we have a result. And of course, that doesn't happen by itself, so we constantly talk to each other in something that is called trilogue, because there's 3 actors. It's the Parliament and the Council as the co-legislators, and then it's the Commission as honest brokers that help us negotiate. Normally, the help is by suggesting that both of us move towards the original Commission proposal. But they are not legislators, so they don't have to agree, they just sit in the room to help us agree. And it is actually helpful because the Council and the Parliament might end up in a stalemate every now and then, and every meeting. So it's very useful. And then we basically say, okay, but we agree on this in principle. Can the Commission please send us a new text by tomorrow morning? And the Commission looks super happy. It's 11 in the evening and say, yes, we will send you a new text by the morning. And they do. It's amazing. Poor people. So when it came to the Parliament, the Council didn't do much. They was like, this is a big clusterfuck. Let's just wait with it as long as possible. And the timing is that the Parliament always have to be done with the text before the Council has to. So the Parliament started looking at it. We gave it to one of the committees, which is the legal committee that work with copyright. We ascribed it to the Conservative group, the EPP, because of reasons. There's a quota system, bigger groups get more files. They handed it out to Teresa Comodini Cascia, who is a Conservative MEP, member of European Parliament from Malta. And she did what no one thought she would do. She invited all the stakeholders. She met with the big industry, she met with academia, civil society, the tech industry, the music industry, everyone. And she did a very thorough work, and then she rewrote the text in her draft proposal. Basically, she said, Article 11 doesn't really work. Let's have another idea. Let's add another way where publishers will be presumed to represent the copyright of their authors unless authors have explicitly said otherwise. Then they can more easily negotiate licenses. That should be enough. And on 13, she had basically removed every mentioning of filter or the need for a stay down and just focus on licenses. So she put that out there, and we were like, wow, that's the Conservatives. They are supposed to be the horrible ones. This is actually a good text. I mean, it's not a perfect text. It's a good text. Given what the Commission gave us, we couldn't have hoped for much better. And then the Panama Papers came out, and the Maltese government collapsed, and they had an election, and the Conservative Party thought they would win the election, and they went to Teresa Comodini Cascia and said, do you want to be a minister? run with us in the elections, and if we get to form a government, you'll be a minister. And it's much more fun to be a minister on Malta than sit in the European Parliament. So she ran in the elections, got elected into Parliament. Her party didn't win, so she ended up a parliamentarian on Malta instead of a European parliamentarian, which is not necessarily better. But after getting elected in a campaign, you can't. Well, she tried. She said maybe I should stay in the European Parliament, and all the people in Malta booed her. And she said, no, of course I'm going to come home to Malta. So she had to leave the European Parliament, and according to the rules, that means that someone else have to take over. And since it was handed to the conservative group, they can appoint whoever. And the Germans, the big German conservative party, who had pushed for the proposal from the beginning, were like, we're not going to mess around anymore. So they took Axel Voss, who is one of theirs, and they said, we know that you have tons of other stuff that you're doing right now, but you're also doing this. And he became responsible for the proposal. And he wanted to reassure everyone, so he went to the Committee of Legal Affairs and said, I will base my work on the draft proposal by Teresa Comodini. And then he threw it in the bin and started over by basically rewriting the Commission proposal, but just making everything slightly worse. And then we had a fight in the Parliament and eventually came to a bad conclusion, and the Council had an equally bad conclusion, and then we negotiated. And the best thing we could hope for was a stalemate that would run until the next mandate, but we failed with that, and they all adopted it in March and April. And that means that it will kick into effect 20 days after it's being published in the official European Journal. And I don't think it has been published yet, so it hasn't kicked into effect. And when it kicks into effect, there will be a 2-year implementation period. So basically, all the member states have 2 years to implement this directive in national legislation. So all the questions you have about how will this affect this detail here and there, well, my answer will be it depends on that national implementation. But since it is a directive, it will be different in different member states. But the platforms are likely to adopt to the most restrictive version, because it will just be cumbersome for them to have 27 different rules for how they monitor and remove content in different European countries. So they will go to the worst implementation, and then they will say, okay, if we fulfill that, we are fulfilling it in all countries. So we'll have to see where the worst implementation comes, and then that is what will happen. And then, of course, the civil society will take them to court, and 4 years from now, or 4 years from that, the European Court of Justice are likely to say that that implementation is not in accordance with the Convention of Human Rights, and therefore that implementation is invalid, and then you have to go for the next worst implementation and attack that in the court, and so on and so forth. That will be fun. The problem here is, of course, the moment all the platforms have the filters in place, even if the court says we can't force them to have the filters. If the filters are already there, the court will not say they're not allowed to have them. They will only say that the EU can't impose filters. So we will end up with filters. Funnily enough, a lot of the pro-reform members of parliament and lobbyists, mainly the copyright industry, clearly said during the whole process, no, there will be no filters. Look, there's no filters in the text. It just said, ensure the non-availability. That could mean anything. And then directly afterwards, Oettinger, basically the day after it was finalized, said the Commission interpreted this as filters being required.